Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here. It's nice to talk to sort of different audiences about some of the work that we're doing. And what I thought I would do in this talk is I'll just talk a little bit about the Data Justice Lab to start off with and the kind of work that we do, because it's a relatively new initiative. It's been around for a couple of years. And what we're trying to do is, I guess, take a particular approach to thinking about the increasing use of data in our society. And then I'll talk specifically about some projects we've done that are focused on the uses of data-driven systems, particularly in public services, and some of the research we did around that, and the sort of project that we're doing now as a follow-up, which is about what the challenges are with that for ideas of civic participation, or how it complicates how we might think about civic participation today. So that's sort of how I'll go through with it in the roughly sort of 30 minutes that I have to talk. So first of all, so just to say that we are a number of people at the Data Justice Lab. We are around sort of 10, 11 people, give and take, depending on different projects. So the stuff that I'll talk about today is very much a sort of collective effort with a number of different researchers. And we are basically a group of scholars who came together to form the Data Justice Lab because we had sort of common interests in thinking about the societal implications of this increasing collection of data in our society across social life. And we wanted to think about that together. And we're located, as was mentioned, we launched officially in early 2017, and we're situated within the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University, which means that we're sort of social scientists predominantly in terms of how we're thinking about this. So what we're doing is not so much actually using data, which I know is what sort of Sage Ocean might be more concerned with, but actually more critically engaging with what the uses of data by other actors means for society, for citizens, for social justice more broadly, as I'm going to talk about. And we are an expanding team of researchers. So we have established scholars. I run the lab together with 3 other colleagues. And then we have an increasing number of postdocs and PhDs that work with us as well. And just to give you a sense of some of the types of projects that we work on. So I have this European Research Council project called Data Justice, which is a broad project really focusing on how we might think about datafication in relation to social justice. And in that, I look at sort of different contentious areas of governance to do with law enforcement, to do with border control and migration, and to do with the workplace. And we're trying to it's a 5-year project, so we're trying to sort of find out developments that are happening in these areas and trying to think about what that means in terms of how we might need to think about social justice differently. But the project that I'll talk about today is the second one, the Data Scores project, investigating uses of citizen scoring in public services, which was funded by an Open Society Foundation grant. And also this one down here, which is the Towards Democratic Auditing, Participation in the Scoring Society, which are sort of follow-up projects from each other. But in addition to looking at those, we're also interested in questions of policy and the sort of regulatory frameworks that we might need to put in place when engaging with data-driven platforms. And my colleague Joanna Redden has a data harms record that she runs that's also on the Data Justice Lab website, which is down there, can barely see, but which is essentially sort of illustrative examples of how we can think about different harms that emerges from the uses of data-driven systems. And this is an ongoing record where she's collecting cases of different types of harm that we might think about. So something that you can access on the website. And then my colleague, Emiliano Treya, has a network on big data from the South, which is trying to sort of expand our parameters for how to think about data that isn't just from the perspective of the West and from the global North, but actually also considering much more outside perspectives in terms of the nature of the debate, something that's really much, much needed. In terms of the sort of work that we do apart from sort of this research is that we are trying to be quite a practice-oriented group, which means that we want to engage with stakeholders of various kinds very much, and we're particularly working a lot with civil society organizations, but also with local governments or other stakeholders that might be relative in a given context. And we do that through various events and workshops. So we actually have we had our first Data Justice Conference about 2 years ago, And we're having our second one this year in May on this theme of civic participation, which you're welcome to register for and participate in. But beyond that, we have what we think of as sort of fact-finding and stakeholder workshops where we bring people together to discuss concerns and common concerns. And we try and do public events that involve policymakers. And because we are located in a journalism school, one of the things that we are trying to do as well is actually work with those who run our journalism programs to think about how the sort of research that we do and the kind of approach that we take to interrogating the uses of data-driven systems can also be integrated into journalism education. Because actually one of the problems we're having at the moment is that the reporting about these developments is very lacking, in part because it's actually really difficult to do. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of doing research of this kind. But actually the kinds of skills that we have as social scientists that we might need to employ when carrying out the projects that we're doing, we're thinking are kind of transferable skills that actually could also be used by journalists. So we're trying to work also with journalism educators to see how some of the approaches we've taken can be integrated into journalism education curricula so we can have more reporting about the types of developments that I'll be talking about. So that's something else that we've been quite keen to do. Since we are at SAGE, I should also mention that we also have launched a book series with SAGE on data justice, with Michael, so there. So this is quite sort of appropriate just also to mention. And we're writing the first book, the four of us, we're running the lab, the first book, which will hopefully be out sometime soon. We're still working on the manuscript, but we'll get there. So just to mention that. So these are the kinds of things that we do and what we're about. Now, how we came to this topic, or how I came to this topic originally, was actually looking at issues of digital surveillance. And particularly, I was involved in a project that looked at the implications of the Snowden leaks, which were first published in 2013, which revealed a number of digital surveillance programs that were being carried out across a number of Western countries, perhaps most prominently the US and the United Kingdom. And one of the things that came out in doing that research was really the extent to which the nature of these digital surveillance programs were really underpinned by this phenomena of mass data collection. And actually we're dependent on this kind of business model that now dominates our digital platforms, our digital technologies, which is this logic of data accumulation in order to carry out different types of analyses. And that kind of logic was really the one that also made possible the types of surveillance programs that we saw revealed in the Snowden leaks. But of course, that was very much concerned with sort of intelligence agencies and security services and that space of governance. But this logic of being seen through data in different ways is actually something that we're becoming quite familiar with across lots of different areas of society. And so what we're seeing emerging is what we're sort of talking about in terms of a datafied society, where more and more aspects of that really crucial to our ability to participate in society are now being influenced or taking on this logic that it's possible to use data, to collect data and analyze data in a way that you might use to make decisions about people, or at least to carry out certain decision-making processes and governance processes in various different ways. So we've had these kinds of stories pop up in various, sporadic kind of ways that really illustrate the extent to which, our ability to get a job or keep a job, or our ability to cross borders, or even if we might go to prison or not, is now actually being influenced by this phenomena that is this mass data collection and this use of data to make decisions about people. And so we wanted to sort of think about what that actually means. And, I'm talking about here this because we're talking about participation today, that there is this paradox of participation, because the sort of relationship we've had with digital technologies has often been that we can use those or engage with those as a way to participate in society. Often, our participation in society is mediated through digital technologies more and more, and it's often how we engage with ways in which we might be active citizens, and trying to influence decisions that govern our lives. So often it's talked about as a kind of empowerment, that these tools can be used to empower active forms of citizenship, that we now have platforms that can mediate our participation in society. But actually, when we rely on these digital technologies to participate in society, we're actually also sort of made citizens by this use of data that is used to then inform how we're also then governed, inform decisions about us that really influence our ability to actually be full citizens in society, as is sort of illustrated by these different kinds of spaces. So, we wanted to think about, this paradox of participation introduces a number of different issues about what is actually then at stake with the advent of these data-driven systems across social life. And so when we're talking about data justice, we're actually predominantly trying to think about a different framing for thinking about what is at stake. Because when we think about the Snowden leaks and the sort of immediate aftermath of the Snowden leaks and the kinds of public debate we had then, often what was at stake was termed according to this notion that, well, this increasing use of data increases efficiency and perhaps enhances state security. Often that was seen as what was made possible, or what is made possible by the use of these technologies. Often that's why they're turned to as efficient and greater efficiency, and in the case of surveillance and state surveillance, often also that we have more security. But that the price we pay for that is individual privacy or concerns about the protection of our personal data. Often it's framed as a kind of, in the aftermath of the Snowden leak, it was framed in terms of sort of a trade-off. The price we pay for more efficiency and greater state security is our privacy and our personal data. But actually, if we think about what we talked about in terms of a datafied society and how these sort of really important areas of our social lives are now changing in terms of the use of these data-driven technologies, that I think we're realizing is too limited a frame for thinking about what's actually at stake. And we've had a host of literature that has suggested all of these other issues we also need to think about when we're thinking about what's actually at stake in this datafied society. And they sort of touch on different issues. So in part, there's been a lot of talk about the way in which this actually entrenches or introduces forms of discrimination, because when you start relying on data about people, often you're relying on historical practices in order to make decisions about something in the future. And that's going to be skewed, and that's going to arguably be discriminatory in terms of the outcomes of that. Or simply that the algorithms that are being designed have variables that will lead to discriminatory outcomes because certain things are weighted in a particular way that might impact on certain groups more than others. So this idea of data discrimination, I think, is increasingly forming a part of our discussion about what's at stake with the datafied society as well. But we've also had other kinds of literature that really points to the nature of which this datafied society is contingent on social and economic inequality. In part because our data isn't collected in the same way. We're not all equally implicated in this datafied society. We don't get monitored the same amount or for the same reasons. And Virginia Eubanks' book makes which has received a lot of discussion and coverage, I think, makes this very clear that not only is it certain populations that are monitored in a particular way and for particular purposes more than others, but also that we're not equally positioned to challenge how data is used about us, right? We're not all given the same choice as to what data is collected about us. So actually, we need to think about this in terms of also what this means for questions of equality. But also just kind of very sort of essential notions about our identities also comes into this. So, the John Cheney-Lippel book on We Are Data is really dealing with this notion of what does it mean when we start being recognized in society through our data? What ownership do we have of our own identity and who we are when these, more and more decisions are based on these abstract data collection processes that are really about people like us in order to make decisions about an individual, right? So what happens to our own sort of idea of identity? And then also, famously Frank Pasquale termed this notion of the black box society that really engages with also the sort of what's at stake in terms of the democratic process. Because overwhelmingly, these systems and these technologies are developed by private companies that are unaccountable and being integrated into governance spaces that we're not able to interrogate how these technologies work, how decisions about us are made based on them, and so forth. So actually the democratic process is also what's at stake with this datafied society. And I think, this is just to indicate all of the other issues that we might have to engage with that really bring to the forefront, where we would argue, sort of fundamental questions of social justice, how we want society to be organized, what role we think these technologies should have in our society, and how we ensure that people's rights and well-being is still maintained within that, right? So we're sort of talking about it, when we're talking about data justice, it's really about this framing. This is just a silly animation to indicate the extent to which we have to think about data as an integrated part of social justice agendas. So now it's increasingly becoming a part of the discussion when we want to discuss issues of discrimination and inequality and our ability to be recognized in society, that we have to consider these technologies as part of those social justice agendas. So that's kind of just to give you the frame of how we're starting to think about this. Now, I'm going to just then talk about this project we did on public services in the UK to give you a little bit more of an indication of how these technologies are actually used in practice. Because one of the problems we have in a lot of these discussions is that it remains very abstract. We don't really know very much about how our data is collected and used, particularly in areas of governance, right? So we did this project on investigating uses of what we term sort of citizen scoring in public services. And we deliberately used this idea of scoring because, I mean, perhaps slightly provocatively, but it was in response to the fact that that's the sort of notion that gets associated often to financial services. We're familiar with the idea of a credit score, for example, that actually we know that data gets collected and used in order to create a score on somebody's credit worthiness. But actually this logic is also something we're finding in government spaces. And we also wanted to use this term because often that gets talked about in terms of China's social credit score. That's the most famous version, if you like, of this phenomena of using data as a way to say something also about citizens' worth, right? But actually, and that's often seen as something that's very alien to us, and that's a different context and all of these things. But actually, this use of scoring and using data to create a score, to make an assessment about people, is something that's also happening here, right? And happening in public services. Now, in not all cases is it actually a numerical score we're talking about of this kind, but it is some form of risk assessment, right? And some kind of ranking or some kind of category about people that's being created. So we wanted to look at that, and we wanted to see how it was used then for the provision of public services. And we, in order to do that, that's actually quite a difficult thing to do because there isn't some list available where everyone, where they list all the uses of algorithms or all the kind of uses of different databases or any of these things. So we had to figure out how we were going to do this. So we used a combination of methods. One was actually data-driven, if you like, or computational method, which was that we used the same methodology that's also used in the US called Algorithms Tips. It's a project called Algorithms Tips. It's a scholar called Nick Diakopoulos who has created this, which basically, based on a number of keywords associated with algorithms and algorithmic decision-making, scrapes all government websites on the basis of this keyword. So we adopted that and did the same for all gov.uk pages, right? And in doing that, we sort of collated a database, if you like. Now, that's not going to tell you very much because this is unverified information. Not all of that is actually relevant to what the phenomena that we're looking at. But we wanted to create something that actually we then made it a searchable database that you can then look at different, say, local authorities or different, say, companies that might be mentioned or something like this to narrow down what you might be looking for. But actually, what we then followed up with was freedom of information requests. So we sent out 423 freedom of information requests to all local authorities and councils, asking them about their uses of data analytics. And we then also did more in-depth case studies where we knew that there was a sort of certain system in use in a certain local authority, and then we pursued that to find out what the actual rationale for that and the practices surrounding that were in these different areas. And in doing that, we found that there are actually quite a number of local authorities that are using algorithmic decision-making for the provision of public services. And in fact, in doing this report, we've had a number of stories that have emerged out of this research in various different ways in the last year or so. We published that report at the end of 2018, and we've had a number of stories come out of that. And what we found is also that there is a few suppliers, private companies that supply these systems, risk assessment tools predominantly, to a number of different local authorities. And where it's predominantly used is in things like benefit fraud, so the risk that someone is committing benefit fraud, in policing, which we're, I think, more familiar with, and then also in child welfare. So predicting forms of exploitation or neglect or abuse using risk assessment tools. Those were the most sort of prominent areas that we found in doing this research. Now that's not going to be exhaustive what we're finding, but it's just some indication of the types of things that we're talking about. And what we found is, for example, in Bristol, they're using this for child exploitation. So they're using, collating something like 35 different social issue data sets to try and predict the likelihood that a child might, so this, all young people in Bristol are sort of allocated a score based on these different data sets that are integrated in order to predict the likelihood that somebody is exploited in some way or another, which is based on previous victims of child exploitation. Right? So everyone has attributed this kind of risk score. We also found it in policing, where in Avon and Somerset Police, for example, they use it for all existing offenders to predict the likelihood that someone might re-offend. Again, sort of collecting data from various different sources to do so. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about this phenomena of citizen scoring. So it's about actually, categorizing, sorting, predicting things about individuals or populations. That's the sort of phenomena that we identified in this. Now, why are they doing this? And I think this is probably where it becomes very interesting. So the context of this development of citizen scoring, I think is very important. That was why doing the case studies was really important, because we wanted to actually find out what are the sort of broader practices surrounding this. So one thing is, in terms of, from the Freedom of Information request, when we actually went through those, it became very clear that there is what we might think of as a sort of interpretive and regulatory vacuum, meaning that actually local authorities really vary in terms of how they understand what you are allowed, or what is the regulatory framework that applies to these uses of data-driven systems, but also their understanding of what actually the use of predictive analytics, which is the thing that we were particularly interested in, what that actually entails when you are engaging with that or not. So in some instances, we found that councils say we don't do any of this, but actually at the same time, they were contracting with some of the companies that provide these risk assessment tools. So there's a disparity there, or sort of an inconsistency in actually an understanding of what it means, right, to be engaging in these kinds of practices. And there also isn't a shared understanding of what it is appropriate to do. So in some instances, we found that councils found that making these predictions about individual households, et cetera, is something that is a useful thing to be doing. In other instances, we found that that's something that they wouldn't be doing. What they sort of shared was that there was an onus on sort of integrating and sharing data to create what they describe as sort of data warehouses. So that was definitely a sort of common trend across the different cases that we looked at. And the rationale often that was provided for why they were turning to these kinds of systems was actually because an austerity context, but actually because they've had lots of resources. Local councils in the UK have had something like up to 60% of their funding cut over the last 10 years. And this is a reaction to a cut in resources and a perceived understanding that these technologies will allow for more efficient allocation of resources by identifying the most high need, right? So this is often the rationale that's provided, which I think is also important because it means that these systems are being introduced in a context of service reduction. And that actually, shapes a lot in terms of what these technologies might do in practice. Because it's, even if you are making decisions and trying to capture risk in this way, it's not clear how councils are actually able to act on that in this context of service reduction. And predominantly what they're trying to do is to get what they describe as a sort of golden view of residents within a city, so a more integrated and granular understanding of the people living within their local authorities. And the types of challenges that they saw with this, so this is predominantly from managers and those who were responsible for implementing these systems. When we asked about the nature of the challenges, often they were seen as predominantly cultural and technical, meaning that the challenges that they were seeing was that, frontline staff, public sector workers aren't necessarily receptive to the introduction of these kinds of technologies and are sort of technologically conservative or not adept at using data and collecting data, and that this is a problem, and therefore they need to be trained in data literacy. So often training was seen as a way of overcoming what we might think of as sort of legitimate hesitations as well, but overcoming what they saw as a sort of culturally organizational conservatism that wasn't necessarily receptive to the introduction of these technologies. And then the other challenge that we heard was things like just data quality, which was often seen as an issue because councils, haven't necessarily have standard ways of collecting data. There are lots of mistakes in the data, lots of errors, etc. So, the error rates were normally actually quite high in a lot of these systems in terms of the internal audits that they would do of that. So, this was also raised as a key issue for councils in this, as a key challenge. And what we thought was interesting as well is that it wasn't really clear, apart from sort of privacy impact assessment and data protection impact assessment, which they have to do, there wasn't really much of an impact assessment beyond that. So not really any consultation with how citizens might feel about this, or whether people were aware that actually data was being used in this way, or data about them was being used in this way, in part because it wasn't clear how they would carry that out. Also not how this would actually impacts on actions taken. So how is this changing professional practices? Those kinds of questions also weren't really dealt with. And it's not necessarily because they don't want to, it's just either a lack of resources or a question about how you go about doing that, right? So this was important for us to highlight, because actually this becomes an issue if you then consider. We did interviews, in addition to looking at speaking to public sector workers, we did interviews with what we might think of as sort of stakeholders from civil society, so groups that are working with communities like service users, or so this would be or welfare rights activists, or also digital rights activists who feel they have a stake in these developments. And actually the types of concerns that they're raising speak to these actually much broader social issues than what we heard when we spoke to public sector workers. So there is a discrepancy between the nature of the challenges. So at one level, there was a concern expressed amongst the sheer extent of data collection and sharing, and concerns about what was being shared between different agencies and different parts of the council. But also this kind of thing that we are becoming more familiar with, which is about the sort of the extent to which these systems are entrenched with bias and discrimination by over-collecting from certain parts of the population, perhaps, and not others, or simply by using variables that might discriminate against certain groups. I think that's something that we have become more familiar with, that was also raised quite a lot by civil society groups. And interestingly also, I think, and this is something I think we talk less about, was the fact that they also thought that these systems lead to forms of stigmatization or stereotyping, that actually by treating people in this way, you stigmatize certain groups that are seen as at risk. And in fact, one person said, what right do we have to label someone as a risk? That even doing that is a form of stigmatization and stereotyping, because they are being labeled as such based on what people like them have done in the past, right? So actually, this is a form of stereotyping and stigmatization, and also targeting certain types of groups. And that also came out. And then a question of agency, the potential for agency in this space. And that's something, obviously, that leads also to this question of civic participation. But it was at two levels where it was expressed. So, for example, one of the groups we interviewed was the British Association for Social Workers. And there you have a question about what agency do the professionals themselves have in this space, in terms of either how they're asked to engage with these new systems, and whether they want to, say, for example, reject certain types of risk assessments or risk scores. What possibility is there to do that, particularly in a context of austerity and lack of resources? But also questions around how service users and citizens are able to actually challenge how they're predicted or labeled or profiled by councils, and whether they know about these scores at all, and what ability they have to challenge how they're scored, right? So we have a question of lack of agency, I think, come out quite a lot. And then finally, something that I think is also important is that they didn't see this necessarily as being an issue about the use of technology, but that actually these technologies are being used to advance a certain policy agenda. So in several instances, we heard that actually, I'm not sure this is about the technology, but this is an excuse to sort of either, shrink service provision, or reduce service provision, or to advance certain social policy agendas that are, dominant at the moment. And interestingly, we were doing this research around the same time as when Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, did an investigation into poverty in the UK. I don't know if you remember that back in November 2018, wrote a quite damning report of poverty, the state of poverty in the UK, and actually included also the use of these digital technologies and these types of data-driven systems as a way of what he describes as, shrinking or undermining the British welfare state. And he has described it as sort of politicization via technology, that this is about pushing through policy agendas using these technologies, right? So those kinds of concerns came up amongst these stakeholder groups as well. And I think, that speaks to the need for thinking about the discrepancy between how these different developments are understood depending on who you ask, right? And just in terms of sort of broader transformations that we might think of in this space, and this speaks to the Philip Alston's notion as well about whether we have to think about this as actually transforming state-citizen relations. So in part, we might think about this in terms of where expertise comes to lie if we start relying on these kinds of data-driven systems for making assessments about people and people's needs and people's risk, right? So there is this argument that actually what we see with the introduction of these technologies is that expertise gets transferred to private calculative devices, right? Moves away from the professional judgments into these calculative devices where it's not really clear what it is that informs that type of expertise, where that expertise actually comes from. And there's also a question with how citizens are positioned. So rather than seeing citizens as co-participants in society, so co-creators of society, in these systems, using these systems, they're predominantly positioned as potential risk. And these technologies predominantly are designed to capture risk, right? So this is how, the logic of how citizens are positioned might come through. And we heard the sort of, also when we spoke to public sector workers, that increasingly their work and their understanding of public services is about risk management and how you manage the potential risk of citizens. And then there is also an argument that actually when you start attributing risk factors to these individual behaviors and characteristics, you start shifting social policy away from focusing on what we might think of as sort of social issues to do with, say, inequality or poverty or a rise in homelessness or other social issues that might actually be the underlying causes of why some people are behaving in a certain way. And you attribute these risks to these individual families or households, or individual people. And so the argument might be here that there is a risk of this individualization of social problems, that social policy starts to prioritize dealing with individuals and seeing them as the root of the problem, while shifting attention away from what we might think of as sort of social structural issues that are underpinning these developments. And that also links to this final point about the fact that there is a shift in logic from, rather than thinking about prevention, these underlying causes, you engage with these forms of prediction in order to continuously preempt forms of behaviors. And there is obviously a question here from a citizenship angle about the extent to which, what happens when we start being governed on the basis of what we're predicted to do in the future rather than who we actually are in our lived experiences, right? So, and what happens to that space between who we actually are and what we're predicted to do in the future, right? And that becomes a really important political space in this context, in this datafied society. Now, these transformations in state-citizen relations suggest that we do need to think about where does civic participation fit in all of this? What say do we have in these developments as citizens at all, right? And that's where we're going now with our work. So having done this stuff, we're trying now to identify what are avenues for civic participation that are being pursued in order to try and, if you like, democratize these developments, or at least open up these developments for some kind of intervention. And what we're looking at, and this is very much sort of work in progress, but we're trying to sort of identify different areas where that might happen. So at one level, we're looking at in terms of the actual government level itself. So within, say, a local authority or council, or within government, what type of consultation processes are happening? Who are they speaking with? Particularly because we've had, in the last few years, we've really had a kind of explosion of some different bodies that are supposed to be representing public interest or citizen interest. So the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, the Alan Turing Institute. Now we also have the Ada Lovelace Institute. There is a number of the Office for AI. we have, a lot of different bodies that have emerged that actually, when speaking to them, talk about that their remit is also to try and insert certain public interest in terms of how, the development of these technologies are being carried out. So we're trying to see how does that translate into actual forms of civic participation. Can we see that as an avenue for civic participation? But also just, in terms of how are they engaging with frontline stuff? How are professional concerns about the use of these technologies actually being consulted with or heard? Or is it being heard at all, right? So we also want to try and find this out, and also what kind of public engagement, how are citizens being informed about these types of developments? And then we're also looking at it in terms of civil society, because we have quite now an active civil society, I guess, or increasingly active civil society around this space that are trying to intervene at policy levels. Particularly that falls down on sort of what we might think of as rights-based approaches. So using, for example, the GDPR or using subject access requests to try and intervene in some way, or to try and find out, predominantly is actually to try and find out how data is being used. Or sort of strategic litigation and procurement. So now there's increasing sort of attention being paid to the procurement process. So the point at which these systems are being contracted. What kind of questions are being asked, what type of impact assessment is being carried out. All of those kinds of questions around procurement is now being, I think, becoming a prominent avenue for inserting some type of intervention. And of course, they're also very much involved in questions like data literacy and campaigning. Raising awareness is another thing. Now, some of the concerns we've heard when speaking to civil society groups about this is that all of these are responsive. So they tend to be reactions to a harm that's already done. So the question is how to make it more proactive, I guess, is one of the challenges that we find with civic participation. Another area that we're really seeing in this, another sort of development we've seen particularly in this space, is a lot of focus on, well, let's have citizen assemblies or citizen juries, or let citizens request their data, so citizen audits, as a way to try and advance also civic participation. So we've had quite a few of these kind of citizen assemblies that have tried to look at this in terms of health or facial recognition or biometrics. There's lots of these citizen assemblies have been carried out, particularly in the last year or so. Of course, there the question is, there's a lot of issues around the legitimacy of these kinds of developments and initiatives, but also how does that relate to that? So to what extent do the things that come out of these citizen assemblies and citizen juries actually translate into forms of institutional reform? Are they listened to? How is that? How do they impact, right? And then finally, we're also interested in looking at civic participation in terms of the creation of alternatives. So whether that's creating alternative forms of technology that are more citizen-centered, for example, or whether it's having a stronger debate about public ownership of infrastructure. So for example, we're looking at the discussion that's had in Barcelona, where it's kind of famously have situated themselves as what they describe themselves as one of the rebel cities, where they're trying to advance a different understanding of data, different deal on data, I think is the phrase that they use, where there's an onus on public ownership, on citizen consultations for deciding on what to do with data in a way that benefits the residents of Barcelona. So we're trying to also look at that, whether these alternative visions is an avenue for thinking about civic participation. But we also have different experiments happening around community oversight, so community groups actually having a say over what technology should be allowed to be implemented in a particular local authority, right? And those are kind of other experiments that are also happening, as well as groups creating their own type of technology, so self-organizing. And I think what we're going to do in the next year is actually continue to sort of try and find out the challenges that are sort of emerging around these different avenues for civic participation, and whether we can sort of identify best practices that we can take forward to try and see if we can increase civic participation in what is otherwise so far been quite a closed field. So I'll end it there on this one, ask questions. Thank you very much.